Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for attending the Defending the Castle, Back to the Future Using Isolated Networks webinar today. Before we dive into the presentation, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. If you have a question at any time during this webinar, please use the Ask a Question tab located below the player. Your question will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At the end of the webinar, please take a moment to rate this presentation and provide feedback using the Rate This tab below the player. There are additional resources for you to check out under the attachments below the player, and you can download these items at any time. Finally, the recorded version of this presentation will be available using the same URL shortly following its conclusion, so feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, John Alexander, Director of Product Marketing at OPSWAT. Over to you, John.
All right, great. Thanks, Lisa. So I'm John Alexander. I'm the Director of Product Marketing over at OPSWAT. I've been involved in the security industry for a little over 14 years and also was involved in the Army Reserves. I was in an Army Cyber Defense Unit for over 11 years and commanded a cyber protection team for several years. And on the civilian side or the corporate sector, my main areas that I've been involved with are vulnerability management and configuration management. So I'll switch over to a little bit and just give a little bit on the OPSWAT, but just this trust no file, trust no device. And OPSWAT's a big defense in depth company, and the whole trust no file mantra is really all about you have to assume that any file can contain malicious content at any time, and we have a lot of technologies that will actually go through a secure data workflow and be able to check that file at different points in time to really follow our mantra of trust no file. So before I start on defending the castle, I want to talk a little bit about what this webinar is about, but part of the title of this webinar was a little bit about back to the future. So a big element of defending really secure networks is drawing back from a past element that's been around for the beginning of computers and defending networks, and that's the concept of an AirGap network. So, and it's amazing, one of these really old technologies and old concepts is one of the most secure ways to defend a network, and I'll kind of go into that and a little bit of the terminology around that. And we typically also use the term isolated network a lot, and we'll kind of contrast that with the term AirGap network, and then talk a little bit about this device called a data diode and how it kind of comes into play with these networks. So first I'll go off and start with the first item and really talk about an AirGap network. And this diagram is a little bit complicated because normally you see a simplified diagram, but I wanted to contrast that an AirGap network, can have a relatively complicated architecture. It's not just the internet, and then you have an AirGap network somewhere hanging off there, but you actually can have several layers of networks. And this is a fairly kind of a common architecture in some industries where you'll typically have a corporate network hanging off the internet, and the corporate network itself will be well protected with a lot of firewalls and gateways and stuff. And then there'll be some other network, some other type of corporate network that's even more protected than that. It's not even allowed to touch the internet. It has to actually go through the corporate network. Again, very well protected with a lot of gateways and firewalls and modern technology. And then ultimately that facility or whatever structure will have very protected networks that are air-gapped or isolated. And a true air-gap network, and I'll talk a little bit about the definition, air-gap basically means no wires or cables. So you're basically, the only way to get in is typically over physical media. You could argue you could get in through wireless, we'll talk a little bit about electromagnetic spectrum, but you're basically, the way to get stuff into an air-gap network is portable media. That could be older technologies like floppy disk drive, CD, DVD, Blu-ray drive, discs, and but the more common method, of course, is the USB drive. So we'll talk about a lot of those items. And you don't necessarily, you could even have more secure air gaps where one air-gapped network only gets data from another air-gapped network, and again, it's moved across physical media. So wanted to kind of show how it can be kind of complicated. It isn't just a simple, you've got the internet and you've got an air-gapped network. Now I want to talk a little bit about isolated networks. And this is not a completely industry-wide term. Air-gapped term is an industry term. Isolated network is basically a superset of an air-gapped network. So it's the same concept, the same things you want to do, but here you're allowed to use certain technologies that give you a lot of the benefits of having an air-gap, but yet have very few drawbacks. And typically, your most common type of isolated network will feature an item called the data diode. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it may not. It could be super well protected by a variety of firewalls and gateways, and a really complicated structure that way. There's different ways you can have encryption, different things. There's a lot of different ways, but this is the common architecture you'll see. And the idea here is when you use a data diode, you're not quite as well protected as an air-gapped network, but then there are a lot of limitations of an air-gapped network go away. So this is a pretty common architecture. A lot of people use it essentially to save costs, because air-gapped networks are expensive. So you'll see this air-gapped, and it really isn't an air-gapped network because you have a cable and then you have this item called the data diode, which I'll talk about in this next slide here. So what is a data diode? Well, it's basically a device that allows data to travel in only one direction. And there's a lot of different ways that they show up, but your most common real data diode is generally using optical cables. And the reason it's using an optical cable is that you can disable the transmit and receive sensors in one direction, so that truly can only transmit in one way. It's just physically impossible to have bidirectional transmission that way. So that's what a data diode is, and it's kind of nice because you're assured of communications going only one direction. So now to come into why are air gaps so good? Why even use an air gap? Well, there's two audiences that kind of argue back and forth between air gaps, and the audience that uses them typically really likes them. And at the end of the day, it is about a huge reduction in the attack surface. I mean, it's pretty incredible how you can. It's hard to get into an air-gapped network, and what you really need to do then, once you do an air-gapped network, is you really need to focus on that reduced attack surface, that little attack surface left. You have to be really secure about protecting that, because you can still get in, right? Nothing is undefeatable, but again, now you don't have to worry about. And I kind of use the analogy of a castle. Here you would have potentially a town without a wall or without a moat, where anybody can get in from any direction. When you have a castle with a moat, you can get in, maybe swim across the moat, but you generally have to go through the front door, the drawbridge, and you can focus your defenses on the drawbridge. Okay, you've got to look at the moat a little bit, you've got to do stuff, but there's just so much less you have to worry about. The other thing is that it requires physical access to attack. To get into an air-gapped network, a person has to go move a piece of physical media across that air gap and go in there, and that requires a lot of risk to the attacker. No longer can you be, some person in a basement, on their computer hacking in. You just can't get in that way. You have to move physical media across that air gap. And it also limits the attack types that can be used, because you're essentially now very difficult to use any type of bidirectional communication. Physical media, you can't just move it across and get data, then you have to move it back again, and then move it back again. And if most people know how attacks work, there's a recon phase typically with an attack where you actually have to go get a lot of data and recon the network before you even mount an attack. So, okay, you've got to go in once physically, get data somehow, bring it back, analyze it, go in. So it just makes it extremely hard to penetrate an air-gapped network. And I've kind of come up with a list of the pros and cons of an air-gapped network. I've never quite seen quite a really comprehensive list, so here's one. These slides, by the way, are downloadable, so they're, you can grab them. But at the end of the day, what it is the benefit of an AirGap network is extreme security. You know, you're limiting the attack surface, and the con at the high level is cost, right? It's more expensive to operate. And why is it more expensive to operate? Well, first of all, you can't get real-time data across. You've got to, because when you're limited with physical media, it takes time to get that data from out of the AirGap network or into it. The cost of actually accessing and moving the data becomes much more expensive. It's more resource expensive to move the data as well. And then again, it all gets down to speed. So you have these cost and data limitations of the AirGap network, but again, with the huge benefit that physical access is necessary. You can't misconfigure an AirGap network. There's nothing to misconfigure. The AirGap is what it is, right? If there's no wires, there's no wires. And again, it's very hard to do reconnaissance of an AirGap network. You've got to bring a person in, you know, to get the data, you know, so it becomes very risky for the attacker. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the attack vectors, and I've kind of covered the comprehensive list here, really 5 items. We're actually not going to talk really about the 4th and 5th item on this list, covert operations and military operations. They're kind of out of the scope of this presentation, but they are the ultimate. So these kind of rank in order of your least likely to succeed to the most likely to succeed, but again, requiring more resources. And we'll talk a little bit about all of them. But the main ones you really have to concern yourself. You've got to concern yourself with all of these if you're protecting a network. You know, you've always got to do your risk assessments, have a really good understanding of the assets under your control. But on this side, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the more common vectors. And the operator is the first one. The operator is like the simplest type of way of somebody getting in, but it generally isn't very effective. And we'll talk a little bit about it. And there's really 2 use cases with an operator penetrating a network or infecting a network. And the real basic common attack is that the operator somehow gets accidentally infected. So the use case here would be that operator is browsing on there, doing something with their computer, and they infect their computer accidentally, doing something they shouldn't have done. And by then they, of course, accidentally infect the portable media that's connected to their computer. And then somehow they move that portable media into the AirGap network. So this could happen, sure. So we've got to protect against everything. But this is an interesting use case because it's extremely easy to protect against it. And if anybody takes anything away, I think everybody that's been operating AirGap networks knows this already, but if anybody doesn't, and if you learn this one thing that I'm about to tell you, this presentation is probably paid for itself, is you have to use facility-owned portable media and use it, you know, in a controlled way. If you use facility-owned portable media, this attack type just can't happen. And what I mean by that is what you'll have is if you'll be a facility that requires the use of USB drives to move in data, those drives will be owned by the facility. They'll be clearly marked. They might be painted a certain color or whatever it is. And that's the only portable media that's allowed into that facility. That way, if somebody, you know, when they're going through the gate getting searched and they have a USB drive that's not portable media, it's easy to say, hey, you know, you can't take this in, right? And this allows this attack type, because if the attacker infects himself and his personal portable media and it's not allowed in the facility, well then it's basically not going to infect the plant. So again, very simple to safeguard against this attack type. The other way that basically the operator gets infected is a little bit more insidious, is that the operator is purposely infected by someone, right? Through some social engineering method, they're targeted and they get infected. So you'll have some organization or some person that purposely wants to infect that operator. And there's basically 2 general types of ways of doing that. One is, I guess I'll talk about it a little bit, but I just think I find it very difficult to actually use, but it's the whole concept of road apples. And the idea here, of course, I think everybody pretty much knows what a road apple is, but it's the idea of putting a bunch of USB sticks in a parking lot or somewhere, and then somebody grabs one and then they plug it in. And I actually have a little bit of a snippet, but you find a lot of different studies that were done on this, on social behavior, but I think the one that I wanted to highlight was back in 2016, 2 years ago, researchers from Google, the University of Illinois, and the University of Michigan, they spread 297 USB drives around the college campus over at Urbana-Champaign, and they had a simple way of detecting if the USB sticks were plugged in for part of the research. But what they found out within less than a day, that 48% of those USB drives had actually been plugged in. So it's not incomprehensible that this will happen. But again, this is actually very easily defended against itself. Again, do not allow non-facility portable media into the location, wherever the air gap that you want to protect. So it's easily defended against. And then the other way that's a lot more insidious is this whole concept of, and it goes by different names, but the USB stealers. There was some software called Brutal Kangaroo that was developed by the CIA that was leaked several years ago, but it's a good example of the USB stealer concept. And I'm actually going to walk through really quickly how this kind of attack works, and then how to defend against it. It's actually fairly easy to defend against as well. And the last thing before I go on to this example of a USB stealer is to talk a little bit about portable media scanning kiosks. And this is going to kind of insert itself a little bit. It's one of the things that OPSWAT does, and OPSWAT does really well. But when you have a media scanning kiosk, whatever vendor you have, you really have to enforce what's called copy to functionality on that device and have a kiosk that supports that. We do, other vendors do, but just make sure you do that. And I'll explain a little bit about what that does. But again, it really enforces that whole idea of facility-owned media. When you copy to is whenever you scan media, you're always going from user-owned media to facility-owned media, always. You never allow personal user media into that facility again. And that copy to is a way of enforcing it using media scanning kiosks. So let me go into an example of a USB stealer. All right, so this might be a little bit of I don't know if it's an eye chart. I hope it's not an eye chart, but it's pretty simple, straightforward, and I'll walk everybody through. It's a 4-step procedure on basically how a USB stealer works. But the idea is that some kind of group is targeting an individual and trying to infect that person. It could be, generally, it's some kind of phishing or social engineering type of attack to infect the user you're targeting system. That system then gets infected somehow, and that software that gets infected is looking for portable media to get plugged into it. So if something gets plugged into it, it infects that USB stick. So that's step number 1, as you can see. And basically then the idea is that person, unwittingly, he doesn't know he's infected, goes into the AirGap network, and he'll plug in, to his computer or some system in the AirGap network and infects the AirGap network. So that's step number 2. And then that software will go off and do reconnaissance. It'll gather data, and it will load that data onto the USB stick when it gets plugged in. It's always checking. And once it gets plugged in, the user unwittingly takes that out again and plugs it into his system again. Step number 3. And then obviously there's some kind of command and control that sends the data off to somebody who looks at it and then injects commands into that malware, which again gets sent to that infected USB stick, and that cycle continues. So you have this simple command and control network that is very unreliable, but theoretically could work. Whether it really worked, I mean, this is you can conjecture this is fairly hypothetical, but it is an attack vector that you have to defend against. But if you notice again, if you again only allow facility media, into your AirGap network, this attack vector will not work. Because again, that originally infected USB stick just won't be allowed into the AirGap network. So again, very easy to defend against. So the real threat for AirGap networks, and this is the people that aren't really big fans of AirGap networks always just say, well, it's the insider, right? The insider is the way you can get into an AirGap network. So it doesn't matter. The insider can get in, so why even bother? Yeah, that's just really kind of silly kind of speculation. At the end of the day, you just have to defend against the insider, right? It's that limited attack surface. And first of all, the insider is a high-risk person. That insider is going in to do something at a very high risk, and it's that limited attack surface. So you really just got to get really good against protecting against the insider. And generally, the insider there's probably more, but basically 4 types of insiders and how they get motivated, right? You have your basic disgruntled employee who's mad about something and just wants to do damage, right? You've got somebody who's got some ideological agenda, pretty similar to the disgruntled employee that does something just because they're just for their ideology. And then the more insidious, the more real kinds of things is the person that gets blackmailed to help on attack, or the person that gets bribed or paid. And the thing I want to highlight here is that you really have to focus on the fact that it might not be just one person, right? You've always got to think it could be a team. It could be 2 people. It could be 5 people, right? So you've always got to really protect against the insider. And let's see. I think a little bit. I'll just read off a little bit about it. But this is really common. But I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the defenses are really knowing what your critical assets are within your AirGap network, doing risk assessments and protecting those assets appropriate to the risk. And of course, all the insider stuff is you've got to be meticulous about background checks, have extremely strong physical security policies, training and awareness all the time. And again, defense in depth like crazy. I mean, video surveillance, logins, you name it. It's, once you have that really, layered defensive depth, I mean, it makes it hard for that insider. That insider makes one wrong little step in your AirGap network, then you know about it. You can take appropriate defense. So again, it's the insider, right? You've got to defend against it, but it's a very limited attack surface. A lot of the people, again, that don't like AirGap networks make it a big deal, but it really, there's so many things that can't penetrate an AirGap network. All you've got to do is really worry about this. It's tough, but it becomes limited. All right, so this is again is a little bit more about protecting the insiders regarding portable media. But again, I will highlight more than ever: do not allow non-facility portable media into your network. It just makes the attack vector a lot harder for that insider. The insider has to scan their portable media, so it prevents the insider getting something in. They're trying to get something in, and the procedures won't allow that malware to get in. You have to be meticulous about logging everything. Again, we're all about what we call secure data workflow, about monitoring the workflow. You've got to monitor as that file moves around. You're logging it if they're really high value files. And again, you have to maintain very strict access control within your facility. So those are kind of some of the key concepts around portable media, and we'll talk a little bit about more about them later in the presentation. All right, so I have this slide, but really I have this slide just to say I'm not going to talk about this, but the next level beyond an insider is that you actually have somebody who's actually skilled at getting in, and they might have spent years to get into your AirGap network, the covert operative. And the only really thing to think about here is that that person or team will be very skilled, at hacking techniques and getting in. So the only takeaway here is that you have to assume that you can be targeted by a covert operative or a covert operation. So you have to assume the people that are trying to penetrate your facility or your AirGap network are very highly skilled. So that's the only takeaway here. All right, so getting a little bit down to really how you defend, right? So at the end of the day, like we've been talking about, the way to get data into an AirGap network is through portable media. And the way you defend against that these days is, it goes by different names, but it's a kiosk. So you'll have a media scanning kiosk, whatever you want to call it. That is the way you've got that on your drawbridge of your castle, and that's the way you're defending against it. So the big important point here is you have to scan everything. You scan all portable media. Anything that goes into your AirGap network needs to be scanned. And the better technologies that you have to scan that media, the better. I mean, this is a real secure network, right? You want to use the best technologies possible. When you scan, pretty much a requirement of a real secure network is that you have a receipt. Then this is more about physical security. When you scan the media, you need a physical receipt to show the guard that your media was scanned. It'll have data. The guard might look at it and go through it. But again, it's proof. You don't just walk across with the USB stick and say it was scanned. So you do have to have capability. The best kinds of systems will do digital manifests. They'll log everything that was done to those files. And they'll also log it to, a good setup is to log it obviously to some kind of logging server that can't be compromised, right? So you'll always, if you have an incident down the road, you can go through the logs and figure out what happened, right? And again, it shows up all the time. Only allow facility-owned portable media into the facility. So this gets down to, and I have a slide on it, the copy to aspects of a kiosk, but a good kiosk setup will provide copy to functionality where you're scanning the media on the user-owned portable media, and it gets copied to clean facility-owned media. So again, it's really all about establishing that secure data workflow. And using a kiosk isn't alone. It's about setting up that workflow with the kiosk to actually work correctly. All right, so this slide talks a little bit about some of the technologies that you really need to have in a kiosk. We deal with our kiosk, which is called the Meta-Defender kiosk, and at the end of the day, it has to support a variety of secure data workflows, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. You need to probably use the best anti-malware technology that you can, and what we believe is the best is what we call multi-scanning. That's using more than one anti-malware engine. The people that usually use media scanning kiosks use typically 4, 8, 12, even up to 20 anti-malware engines, which we easily support. So that's the kind of anti-malware scanning you want to use. You want to use copy to functionality. So you want to be able to restrict what goes onto facility-owned media, and our kiosk supports a data workflow that allows that. You could set up a lot of different ways it copies over, but you can enforce that policy where only media that is completely clean gets copied over. And then we do very granular logging on everything, exactly what happened, exactly what if something gets blocked, it gets blocked, and what hit it. What anti-malware engines said it and had malware, so very, very granular level of detail. Now, let me get back to that last little point about secure data workflow, and that's being able to set up different policies. For example, we support user and role-based policies. So, for example, if you have a guest needs to get media or a vendor needs to get media into a facility, that can be a role-based policy on the kiosk, and it may only allow, for example, exe and DLL files through, and it has a variety of things. You can get to that level of granular detail where that person's not allowed to move anything into the AirGap network except for certain files. You could restrict file sizes. You really want to be able to really limit what a certain role can do, and then again, you might enforce more logging on certain more high-risk roles, et cetera. So, and it's something that vendors can help you with. We're pretty experienced with different workflows. And most people that are familiar with AirGap networks kind of understand what they need to do, but you really want a lot of configurability in that area. So, all right, and now we're going to go ahead and move on. So talk a little bit about each of these elements. So again, we do multi-scanning. I think most vendors that provide media scanning kiosks do some form of media scanning, but we typically excel in the fact that we have a ton of engines. Typically, most people use 8, 12, 16, or 20 engines when they do multi-scanning. And the whole idea is that one anti-malware engine is just not enough. And we've run studies, a variety of companies have done studies where you've taken very random samples of malware. And typically, this will amaze most people, a really good anti-malware engine, just one, will typically have like a detection rate that's like in the high 90s or maybe up to the low 90s, right? 91%, 92%, which kind of surprises people. They think it should be higher, right? But it really isn't. And you can this is almost statistically proven. Once you run more anti-malware engines, we typically find that 8 engines is kind of a sweet spot where you get kind of a value added, where you pretty much hit around the 98% detection rate. And you can go higher. You start getting into diminishing returns once you go to more engines, but you could easily get into the 99% running enough anti-malware engines. And this is against known malware, but a variety of our engines also do heuristic detection as well. So there is protection against zero-day type malware. And we have, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I'll skip a little bit ahead. We do have a technology called CDR, which sometimes we call data sanitization, but it's the whole idea of certain kinds of files, productivity files. We actually completely strip active content out of those files so they're completely harmless on the other end. So, and that's really good for zero-day attacks, because if you can strip content out of a PDF file or a Microsoft Excel document, you know that document doesn't have anything. It doesn't matter if it's a zero-day or it has a known vulnerability. The vulnerability, the threat itself is gone out of that file. I think the last little piece I'll talk about on multi-scanning is there are some disadvantages, but they're very minor. The speed is almost inconsequential because a lot of the scanning can be done in parallel. So you take a very low speed hit by doing multi-scanning. And then the cost relative to what you're trying to secure is, it's very inexpensive to run multi-scanning. It costs more, but again, the value, is really there. You really want to make sure you hit everything. I highly advise never running just one anti-malware engine. So I'll talk a little bit more about copy to. Copy to, the whole concept there too is not just about making sure you use facility media, but it is about, if you use facility media, you also want to wipe that media all the time. I mean, and when you say wipe, you're using an industrial strength wiper where it wipes everything, including the boot sector. So that media is always completely clean. After it's been used, it gets cleaned, and then it's given out to be used again. So it prevents against things like bad boot sector malware. It prevents against firmware infections. They're just not there. You have clean media, right? So that's the whole advantage again of using copy to stuff. This whole idea of your USB stick somehow getting infected and going through, it just doesn't happen when you're using facility-owned media. And then on logging, Not much there. It's the standard logging that everybody needs to do, but on the kiosk, really, if depending on how you set up your workflows, you really want to be logging that file, in different places. But here we're really talking about logging it at the kiosk itself, and really want the more detail, the better. Really, you're not really moving a lot of files typically, so the more data that you have to go back, who scanned the file, down to what time it happened, down to what the file was, what was there, etc. You really want to get down to that level of detail. And ultimately, just like any kind of logging, you want to make sure the logs can't be tampered with. So, you use something like syslog, moving stuff over a secure log server that's, pretty much tamper-free. So that's a big protection, again, because you might be dealing with insiders, right? So you want to be able to, if somebody does something, it gets logged so somebody else can figure out something strange is going on. And anti-tamper, so that's another big one. You want, at the end of the day, you want to make sure this kiosk or the scanning device can't be tampered with. So obviously, almost every kiosk you'll have is locked down, so you can't physically get access to it. They'll all have a really rigorous protection against bad portable media devices getting plugged in. Bad USB, if people aren't familiar, are basically devices that may not be a USB drive that typically look like a USB drive. It can be used to like it could be a keyboard that looks like a USB drive, and then you could try to hack into that device. And what we do at OPSWAT is we actually have our own device drivers. We link at that level, at the USB level, where we have a lot of protections against that. And it pretty much, bad USB devices just really, against a lot of good kiosk solutions, just can't happen. They'll get detected, and they won't be allowed. And then finally, I recommend on the kiosks, depending on how you use the kiosk, some people, the kiosks aren't even accessible to users. You might have to give your portable media to like a guard, and they'll actually scan your media for you. That's one approach. If you do have them out where people can actually scan their own media, I would always highly recommend that you have video surveillance on the kiosk. So if anybody is trying to do something funny with the kiosk, you'll have the logs, you'll be able to sync them up with the video surveillance, etc. Okay, so I'm kind of winding down a little bit. We're going to roll into questions really quick. So I think this might be one of the last slides. And I talked a little bit about it in some ways, about user and role workflow support, but also want to talk about two-factor authentication. And so if you're running a kiosk, you really should have two-factor authentication, where it's not just somebody typing in a password. It really should be, we support Active Directory, but you also might want to run some kind of, I'm thinking military, a CAT card, or some kind of media card, or so in any way have some kind of two-factor authentication to get into that kiosk. So it's not just a person with a password. And that's easy for us to do, obviously, on our kiosks. On the workflow support, I don't want to even go into the amount of detail that we do, but it's really configurable down to, again, you could have a certain role being allowed to only move a certain file type across, and the size of the file might even be limited, stuff like that. The workflow support that we provide is just granular down to that level, and you really do. You may not need that level of granularity, but you really do need to think about your workflows on moving media. I think that might be it on the wrap up. Let's see. Yeah, and just rolling into the summary. So I'll just kind of go and highlight again these, but the big thing about this presentation is really isolated networks or AirGap networks. They're not for everyone. You really have to have a critical security requirement to use them, and the whole reason behind that is they are more expensive to operate. You can already tell if you've got to have to use portable media to move data across back and forth. they're just more expensive. You don't have access to real-time data, but they are. Don't let anyone tell you that AirGap networks are not secure. They are massive instrument for those that need to use them. They raise the security level an incredible amount over non-AirGapped or non-isolated networks. The huge benefit of an AirGap network is that they require physical access to infect or move data, and that raises the risk profile of the attacker up significantly. You just can't have a scenario where somebody's, in an office, in a basement, going in. They just can't go in. A person has to move a piece of media into that network. The insider threat is the main attack vector. Again, it is a very significant threat, has to be dealt with, but it's a very limited threat type. You have to protect it. You have to be very serious about protecting the insider threat, but it is a very narrow attack vector that you can defend against. As far as defending your AirGap network, a kiosk is a critical part of that secure data workflow. At the end of the day, if you have an AirGap network, you need a kiosk solution somewhere. And then it kind of raised a lot of the things to look for in a kiosk solution. But you want facility-owned media, you want to do multi-scanning, you want the best possible anti-malware protection you could possibly have, you want copy to functionality. And then finally, again, with isolated networks, you really can focus just on that limited attack surface. A lot of it's protected, so now you just focus on the remaining pieces that you need to worry about. So that pretty much dives into my presentation. I'm going to go through. We do have questions, so I'm going to go through and answer. Let's see what we've got. Yep. Okay. So the first question that I have is, how do you update your USB scan engine kiosk in an air-gapped environment? So that's a really valid question. And the kiosk itself does not sit in the air-gapped environment, but typically it is siphoned off. And there's really two ways of doing it. One nice thing that we do is we have a USB updater. So you would load the definitions, you'd have to load them off, and they're all hashed, all in a secure method. And if you had physical kiosks that are not connected to the network, you would have to go to each kiosk with that updater and update the virus definitions. Again, everything's hashed out, so no possibility of getting infected, but there is a manual process. The other way is you can set up, let's say you have more than one kiosk, you could set them up on an isolated network where they're only connected, and then we have a way of being able to move all the definitions out to all the kiosks at one time. A little bit, that's less secure, obviously, because somebody penetrates that little isolated network, which you need to well defend. They could somehow, get in on your kiosk. But if you have a really good strategy, it works fine. But again, on the isolated kiosks, very hard, very easy to get the definitions. They're moved securely, hashed, and very, very secure method of updating without being able to tamper into the kiosk. All right, next question. Doesn't a kiosk like this, which sees everything going in or out, become the best attack vector? And if it's compromised, at the minimum, an attacker will gain surveillance about the data that is moving. Yeah, again, that's a really good question. And it's kind of been raised recently. First of all, the kiosk is really hard to get into, right? But that's not a good enough answer for everybody. One of the things that we're doing right now, and we'll be actually releasing as a product in OPSWAT, I think it's maybe about a month or two away, is something internally we call secure image. But it's a highly protected image, but also the image, the system itself will be monitored with file integrity management. So if something happens to the kiosk, it'll raise flags, right? So it'll be extremely hard to actually get into the kiosk. But the person who wrote this question is right. If you did get into the kiosk, it would be a nice little attack vector looking at data. The problem is, again, and we've seen that problem, we've seen the concerns. You really want to be able to protect the kiosk against tamper, and that's what we've been striving for here at OPSWAT. And we've got a couple other basic questions here. Let's see. If I am using a data diode, does it mean my network is secure? Nothing means your network is secure no matter what you use. A data diode is really just a device that allows you to have a lot of the benefits of an AirGap network with very few of the disadvantages. The nice thing about a data diode is it allows you to move data through across from an isolated network faster than an AirGap network. And because the data can only go one way, it protects you against a lot of things like command and control attacks. It can be very good about protecting against exfiltration of data, right? Because usually a data diode, the software that you put in front of it will have all kinds of filters and guards to look at the data. Usually, and I didn't really talk about this a lot, actually most cases the data diode isn't really used for getting into the network. It's more used for protecting data getting out of the network. It's used a lot like in a lot of critical infrastructure for real-time data. You'll have a data diode that looks at certain it only allows very limited kinds of files to get through. If the data is not like real-time data that looks a certain way, it won't even let the data through, right? So it's very hard to exfiltrate data through a data diode that way because of all the filters and guards that are put in with one. Let's see what else. Here's another good one. I'm using a next generation firewall to secure my network. Why do I need anything else? That's a great question. And it really, if you ever do a lot of reading, if you want to go into this topic about AirGap networks, you'll have a large group of people that will say, you don't really need AirGap networks because, you know, my firewalls and my gateways, they're so great. They're using the most advanced technology possible, you know, with advanced artificial intelligence, et cetera. But the reality, at the end of the day, and a lot of firewall people don't really want to admit this, firewalls and gateways, no matter how advanced, can be misconfigured. The beauty of an AirGap network is you can't misconfigure something that isn't there. If a wire isn't there, you can't misconfigure the fact that the wire isn't there. But firewalls and gateways, no matter how good they are, there's user error. They can be misconfigured, and people can get across. Let's see. Looks like I've got one more. How do I hold files secure once they are transferred to my secure network? That's a really good question, and it's kind of like something that I didn't talk about a little bit, but we support a variety of other workflows with OPSWAT. And one of the things that we actually provide is a product called Vault, which allows you to store data inside the AirGap network, and allows you to get access to it in a very controlled manner. So that's generally what you'd want to use. The example here would be once you move your media across with the portable media, you could use a data diode to move it inside this vault, or you can have a physical station on the inside the AirGap network to move it into the vault. Then once it gets into the vault, it's encrypted, and so you have to get in with a password, role-based access control as well. And we even get down to the point where we support moving files where you might have more than one person has to have access to and actually has to give their approval to move a file. So if you send a file and you actually might have to get your supervisor approval or approval from someone to look at it first before you can actually get access to that file, things like that. So that's kind of like the key. And they come in different flavors, but some kind of vault, secure kind of server type technology is typically the best method to use on controlling files inside of the isolated or AirGap network. All right, well that pretty much concludes my presentation. Let me see if there's any more questions. I do have one more, actually. What is running in the back end of the kiosk, the OS, the software, etc.? So I'm assuming we can talk about ours solution because every kiosk will be a little bit different. I'll talk a little bit about it, but our system is actually running on Windows. It actually can support a variety, almost pretty much any Windows variant. And it is a hardened image, and like I said, we are moving into providing that the OS is protected by by file integrity management. And a lot of people ask us why we use Windows. And one of the things about our kiosks is we provide better USB driver support and malware engine support than some of the other vendors, because there's more, I don't know if people know this, but there's more anti-malware engines on Windows than any other OS. And there's better, I hate to say it, there's better USB driver support on Windows than any other OS. So those are typically two of the reasons that OPSWAT's chosen Windows. And to get to defray the idea that Windows can be easily penetrated, we've worked with this whole concept of a hardened image, and now working in this idea of a secure image with file integrity management. Yeah, keep getting into more questions, and I think I've got one last one that I'll take, and I'm not gonna. We'll respond to everybody offline with the others. What update interval do you use for the kiosk AV definitions? We actually provide updated antivirus definitions 4 times a day. So that's as often as you could go. Now, in theory, you may not want to update that often because it's just hard. If you have to go around and update every kiosk 4 times a day, it doesn't make sense. So you've got to do a risk assessment on what you do. But we provide very, very frequent antivirus definitions on our side. All right, well, that is it. I really appreciate everyone spending the time to listen to this webinar. If anybody does have any questions, please post them, and I'll get back to everyone. Great. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the morning. Thank you.